This week, the iPad turns 10 years old, and I think we all know how that little project turned out. In the heady days of the early 2010s, though, the tablet space was white hot, and basically everyone wanted a piece of the action. Things have changed since then, and now few companies seem interested in continuing to play the tablet game. I mean, there's Samsung with their Galaxy Tabs, and Amazon has something for everyone, and Huawei's still doing stuff, and Google is, well, they just gave up entirely. But for many, the iPad is the tablet to own, and whether it's because of better software, or a lack of real competition, or just some really great marketing, I am inclined to agree. But that's not what I want to talk about today. I want to talk about the tablets that tried and failed to dethrone the iPad. Not because I want to rub salt in old wounds or dwell on failures, but because these devices were ambitious and creative and fascinating. Even though they died quiet, ignominious deaths, they're worth celebrating too, if for no other reason than because they helped shape the market that Apple eventually found itself succeeding in. We should start at the beginning with the original 7-inch Samsung Galaxy Tab, which wasn't just Samsung's first tablet, it was also the first Android tablet really worth taking seriously. There was stuff like the Dell Streak that came before it that maybe counted. It had a 5-inch screen, but it was garbage basically all the way through. In any case, and for better or worse, the Galaxy Tab wasn't much more than a larger version of the Galaxy S smartphone. I know that doesn't sound terribly ambitious, but the original Galaxy Tab was pretty impressive for the time. It used the Samsung Exynos 3110 chipset with a 1 GHz processor and 512 megs of RAM, so it ran Angry Birds and basically everything else like a champion. It also had two cameras, one for selfies and one for proper photos and video, which was kind of wild because back then, not even the iPad had cameras. It had 0 cameras, to be clear. Because this is Samsung we're talking about, it had enough resources to commit to a tablet strategy long term. And so the Galaxy Tab spawned a series of sequels and spin-offs that continue to this day. But most other companies weren't quite as persistent or as lucky for that matter. For months after the Galaxy Tab's launch, Android tablets from just about every company with a production line were filling store shelves. But things got really serious when Motorola announced the Motorola Xoom tablet at CES in 2011. Thanks to the Droid line of smartphones, Motorola was one of, if not the premier Android device maker at the time, and the Xoom tablet outclassed just about all of its Android competition. Its screen was a little bigger and more pixel dense than the iPads. It had a Tegra 2 CPU with 1 gig of RAM that helped keep things moving at a really respectable pace, and most other Android tablets simply could not touch its battery life. It was even a little future-proof too. It launched with an EVDO Rev A radio for Verizon service, but you could actually have the hardware swapped out. You could send this thing in and have that radio replaced with a new, at the time, LTE model, which was kind of crazy. No other tablet had tried anything like this before, although I kind of remember that swap process being kind of a mess. In any case, the real draw was the fact that the Xoom was the first tablet to ship with Android 3.0 Honeycomb. To date, the first and only tablet-specific Android update. It looked nothing like earlier versions of Android because of a cold, flat, Tron-like aesthetic, which I honestly miss. But more broadly, Honeycomb gave Android tablets a sense of progress and completeness that they never really had before. They weren't complete, there was still plenty of work to be done, but it was a clear sign that Google was taking tablets seriously. The Xoom, unfortunately, was not a huge success itself. It sold a few 100,000 units in 2011, and it was replaced at the end of that year by the terribly named Motorola Zyboard. After that, Motorola just kind of bowed out of the tablet race completely. Fun fact, the man who spearheaded that Android redesign, Matias Duarte, also laid a lot of the visual groundwork for Palm's Webos, which launched on the Palm Pre in 2009. That coincidentally also means he's sort of related to another tremendous tablet flop, the HP touchpad. If anyone remembers the touchpad these days, it's probably because of the insane fire sale that marked the end of its all too brief life. When it launched on July 1st, 2011, the base 16GB model cost $500. Less than 2 months later, HP discontinued every Webos device entirely, so you could buy one of these brand new mint-in-box tablets for $100 before long. HP deserves all the blame in the world for not giving Webos a serious chance, but let's be honest, the touchpad, which by the way was the very first Webos tablet, it just wasn't very good. It had a decent 10-inch screen that went pixel for pixel with the iPad, but the tablet itself wasn't particularly powerful or nice to hold. And I say this next bit with all possible respect and affection, Webos was not great at its job. It was called Webos at least partially because all of its apps were built using HTML and CSS and JavaScript, which is cool if you want to build, I don't know, an RSS reader or a Yelp app or something, but it's absolutely worthless for anything more complex or interesting than that on a smartphone. HP wasn't the only tablet maker to get screwed by software. For some reason, Blackberry decided, yeah, let's try and take down the iPad with one of our own, so they built the Blackberry Playbook. And honestly, the hardware didn't give us much to complain about. It had bezels that were wide enough to make it look like a digital photo frame, but I don't know, it was 2011, you have to give these things a pass. The real knock against the Playbook was that the Blackberry Tablet Os was based on a platform called Unix, which meant it had to try and build an app ecosystem from scratch. To its credit, there were about 3,000 apps available at launch, but many of them were half-assed Flash game conversions, and a lot of them were just not optimized for tablet use at all. And worst of all, Blackberry, or Research in Motion at the time, I guess, didn't really give people a reason to develop for the Playbook. And when I say the Playbook needed apps, I mean it needed apps. It did not ship with an email client or a contact manager app, which 10 years later is still one of the most insane decisions I've ever heard. Blackberry Tablet OS 2 launched 6 months later and brought with it the ability to run Android apps, but by then it was too late. The Blackberry Playbook's chances of success were basically nil. And anyway, who would buy a Playbook that ran Android apps when you could just buy one of Google's Nexus tablets instead? In many ways, these were the clearest philosophical counterparts to the iPad, and I remember specifically the original Nexus 7 really fondly. Different companies made the hardware at different times, so Asus made the Nexus 7s, and then Samsung came in to do the Nexus 10, and then HTC finished things off with its ill-fated Nexus 9, but they ran clean versions of Android, and they were all given Google's blessing, so they were essentially the standard bearers of the Android tablet experience. And barring some hiccups, they were mostly solid machines too. The bigger issue there is that Solid doesn't always sell. None of these devices were terribly remarkable, which probably explains why Google gave up on the Nexus tablet project in 2014 with the Nexus 9. I remember that thing well too, and not for great reasons. I kind of regret now in hindsight spending my weekend at a wedding writing a review for it. Oh, and Microsoft's original Surface tablet deserves a mention here too. It was and still is a beautiful machine, and like the Playbook, its operating system was by far its greatest flaw. Everything looked properly Windows 8 with lots of big icons and blinky live tiles and stuff, but it ran a stripped down version of Windows called Windows RT, which was designed to run on the NVIDIA Tegra 3 chipset. Because of that, you could look at an interface that kind of functioned like the Windows desktop, but you couldn't run Windows desktop apps. You had to wait months for the original Surface Pro before you could do that. Some people apparently missed the memo and bought Surface RTs thinking they could run Windows apps and ultimately wound up with hardware that couldn't do what they needed them to do. And even people who did know exactly what they were getting into with the Surface RT were burned by a lack of quality apps available for the platform. Things eventually got so bad that Microsoft ate nearly $1 billion in the form of a revenue write-down because no one was buying these things. I bring up the Surface now not to poke at an old failure, but to point at it as an example of an idea that came well ahead of its time. Or I guess if you're a cynic, history repeating itself? Possibly, I guess we'll see. Microsoft is trying something very similar right now with the Surface Pro X, but we will have to wait and see if it can deliver what the Surface RT simply couldn't. I can think of a few other devices that made a lot of noise about taking on the iPad, including one that our sister site TechCrunch tried to build in 2010. It was a weird process and it didn't work out for anybody, but I am digressing at this point. In any case, the annals of tablet history are indeed filled with flops, and that makes Apple's success feel even more meaningful. But let's not forget one important thing. The iPad was made better by all of the competition, continually raising the stakes. Samsung and HTC did sophisticated tablet styluses before the iPad Pro ever did, and I have to wonder if iPadOS would exist in the form it does now if Microsoft didn't keep plugging away at the Surface formula. Whether you like Apple's tablets or not, I think we can all agree on one thing. iPads owe a huge debt to the devices that tried and failed to take them down. Whew, that was a lot of words about tablets. Thank you so much, as always, for watching. We're so grateful that you continue to give us your support in these especially weird times, and we're going to keep doing our best to give you this. Videos about fun stuff, hopefully. Please like and subscribe. Please stay safe, take care of each other, and we'll see you next time.